I'm David Paterson, who is hosting this show, and my guest is very unique this week. You know him as Curtis Sliwa, who is on sabbatical here from WABC as he continues his mayoral campaign. But Curtis and I are two people who can honestly say that our lives have intersected with each other on more than one occasion and for some very interesting reasons. We'll go into that a little bit later, but right now let me welcome my co-host for this program, Curtis Sliwa.
Oh, and the final weekend of St. Patrick's Day parades, earlier I was with Vicky Palladino, Bell Boulevard, Bayside. Then I was in Garrison Beach in Brooklyn. Then I realized, hey, wait a second, I got to join Governor David Paterson for Left versus Right. So, yeah, it's been busy out there.
And tomorrow we'll both be honoring the Greek parade with John Catsimatidis. I heard he has a float there, so maybe he'll let me sit on it or at least walk behind it or something like that.
Well, will any of my competitors be there? Do you have any heads up? Because Eric Adams has been a fixture there as mayor. Andrew Cuomo, I don't think he's ever marched in that parade. And the others, I don't think they would march in that parade.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So, even though we're doing left versus right, there is a mayoral campaign going on. You're a part of it. I've heard that you have a secret plan for how you can pull this out in November. Anxious to hear about that. And also anxious to hear what you think about the other opponents, the ones who are under indictment and the ones who should be. No, I'm just kidding.
What do you know that we need to know there? What do you mean, others who should be?
well, there's just some of the candidates that are running are just not particularly impressive. They haven't raised any money, and yet they still see themselves as viable opponents. So, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But give me your insights into what's going on right now.
Well, the last time I ran, it was me versus Eric Adams. And in a one-on-one race, when you're going up against any Democrat, it's very difficult for a Republican just because of the voter registration. I didn't do too bad. I got 29%. And I was the first Republican ever to win the Chinese American vote. Rudy was not able to do it. Bloomberg was not able to bribe them to do it. I was able to do it because I had a very good relationship in their community over the years. So we made progress there. And then Zeldin did extraordinarily well in the city, much better than anticipated, almost helped him win. And we saw President Donald Trump got 30% of the vote. A big turnout for him in the Bronx and Queens and the Latino communities. So I'm trying to build
and
off of that.
That would have been, about 5 to 8% more than he got in 2020 when he ran 2020 when he ran for president.
Correct. And almost all of it was in the Latino community, Bronx and in Queens, especially Corona, Elmhurst, Jackson Heights. People were stunned that he did as well as he did. The other thing is, Gov, we have to acknowledge that even though he got 30%, some of that was because 500,000 Democrats who normally vote in presidential elections did not come out to vote for Harris in New York City. That's a stunning number. They didn't vote for Trump. They just stayed home. Now, why do you think that was? That people who didn't like Donald Trump, because clearly they don't, many of the Democrats in New York City, why they wouldn't even come out and vote for Harris, 500,000 of them, less than voted for Joe Biden the last time in 2020?
I hearken back to the mayoral election in 1993 when the black vote would have reelected Dinkins, but the black vote was down, was it 10 or 15%? People voted with their feet. They didn't really want to vote for the candidate, Giuliani, who became mayor. But at the same time, they weren't happy with where the city was. So I think it was that kind of scenario. I think people don't like a lot of things that Donald Trump says. They don't like his methods. They don't trust his credibility on certain issues. But they know that the country was severely hindered by 4 years of lackluster, if not inaction, by President Biden. And they passed it along by saying, you know what? This guy says he can fix the problems. Let's give him a chance to fix it instead of the ghost that we know, which has made our lives not what they were 4 years ago.
Well, let me tell you something. You are the only person who has agreed with me on the outcome of the 1993 election. Round two, Giuliani versus, in that case, Mayor David Dinkins. It was not the extra white vote on Staten Island that showed up at the polls because there was secession on the ballot.
Right.
Guy Molinari had said, we're not being treated right. We're the forgotten island. We are going to secede from New York City. And yes, they did have an additional turnout, but there were only 500,000 people in all of Staten Island. Whereas Southeast Queens, majority black middle-class homeowners who had helped propel Dinkins to victory the first time, you were right. When I looked at the analytics, most of them just didn't seem to want to come to vote, and they didn't vote for Giuliani. That was a no-no.
Right.
But they didn't come out for David Dinkins. Now, first time because he was the first black mayor of New York City, definitely leading in the polls against Giuliani the first time. But the second time around, disappointed, didn't feel that he had delivered his promise. And rather than just cross over and come and vote anyway for Giuliani, they just stayed home, which is exactly what happened in this presidential election in New York City. 500,000 Democrats chose not to vote for anybody, not in that, especially Harris. Boy, that has to cause a lot of soul searching by Democrats in a city that, if you were to take a vote about Donald Trump tomorrow, would be so negatively aligned against him.
When Harris and Trump debated the first time, I thought Harris did very well. I thought she shook him up a little bit. I think he made some good points, but I would have given that debate to her. I think after that debate, that's when I mark her high point in the campaign. You never even heard from her anymore. She didn't come to the Alfred E. Smith dinner. There were other events in other states she didn't think she had to go to. She was acting almost as if she was up 20 points and didn't want to blow the lead. The reality was she was probably even with President Trump, and then he wound up, 5 points ahead of her, which in a presidential election is a significant victory.
Well, I remember that debate coming on with Sid in the morning. Sid felt Trump had lost. I felt Trump had lost. Because remember, Harris exceeded expectations. She was vibrant. She was going back and forth with him. She wasn't a dullard. She didn't have any word salads that night. She was actually a very good debater. And then you're right, the rest of the campaign, I don't know if the advisors put her in a box and said, don't extrapolate, don't do stand-up where you're just speaking away from the prompter. But she was so tightly wound. And then having her vice president, Tampon Tim, I mean, he was no match for J.D. Vance in his debate.
And he's gotten into some more trouble just in the past few days. I'm sure you've read about his comments and his critiques out in Wisconsin, where they are objecting to a lot of the administration's policies. And he never quite seems to make any sense.
I'm telling you, a major mistake made. Now, as we look back and play Monday morning quarterback, Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, would have been a much better vice presidential candidate. I think what we heard was from the former attorney general of the Obama administration, our own local guy, I'm forgetting his name.
Eric Holder.
Right, who went to Stuyvesant High School, grew up in southeast Queens. He said that Harris felt that Shapiro would outshine her on the campaign trail, whereas Tim, the governor of Minnesota, was more of her match, sort of her Ed McMahon. He would cheer up the crowd. He was the pitch man. He wasn't the dominating one. And apparently they felt that Shapiro was too strong a secondary candidate, which I think was a big mistake. I think Shapiro might have gotten them Pennsylvania, and I think Shapiro would have been a better match against J.D. Vance, who, in my mind, exceeded expectations in his debate. He was actually nice to governor of Minnesota. Tim, remember, Tim was taken aback by that.
Yeah, and he said, I agree with most of that. Let me just add this one point. It was brilliant. I've got to give it to him.
And then remember how he looked over and stunned? He looked like Rodney Dangerfield, like, oh, my God. He was just I don't, for the life of me, understand why they wouldn't have gone with Shapiro. Young, rising star, Jewish American, good governor in Pennsylvania. Nobody has faulted him. And I think he also would have exceeded expectations and would have raised up Team Harris. But again, for whatever reason, that decision was made not to take him on the ticket.
Every NBA team knows it's not who scores the most points, it's whether or not we win. And if he scored more points than her and they still won, she'd be in the White House and, well, I'm not really sure.
Wait a second. Are you doing a Stephen A. Smith? Are you ready to go up to LeBron and say, why do you have your son Bronny on the team? The guy can barely score. He's taking up space on the bench. Do you want LeBron James to punch your schnoz right down your throat, Governor Paterson?
Well, I think now that Luka Doncic, how did Luka Doncic get from the Dallas Mavericks to the Los Angeles Lakers for a guy who has two bad knees? I don't get that.
Well, not only that, but boy, okay, you could be a star in Dallas, but let's face it, if you're a star in L.A., a star in New York, a star in Chicago, on the hardwood, on the basketball floor, you're going to live in infamy.
Now let's talk about President Trump and some of his policies now. Jim Cramer, yesterday, on Friday, is very much in favor of his tariffs. He thinks his tariffs will work. He thinks that they are really the part of getting rid of an old system that really wasn't working. I was wondering, on the left or right, or whichever way you're coming from today, how you feel about this.
The President Donald Trump is moving so fast on so many levels, and obviously the tariff he's always been truthful about. He felt this was the way not only to level the playing field, but to raise revenue, as opposed to taxing the citizens. I have vertigo from all the countries that in one moment we're going to be tariffed, and then 7 days later, no tariff or half tariff. I never did well in math, so it's a little too fast-paced for me. I have vertigo from all these tariffs that are flying around. I'll never forget the previous Prime Minister, Trudeau Jr. of Canada, directing his look in the camera and saying, "We're going to hurt you, America. You're hurting us with the tariff. Don't you know how important we are to your economy?" I don't think he realized he was enraging Americans like Trump was enraging Canadians by saying, "You will be our 51st state, whether you like it or not."
Right, exactly. And he's gotten a lot of support from this. Now, some of the economists feel that this is going to lead to a recession. There are some who are afraid that it's going to trigger a disinterest in the marketplaces. I am of a feeling that if the president is more consistent with it so that people like yourself understand it better, that they'll be supportive and it might not lead to some of the horrors that his adversaries are predicting.
I think because he's gotten such a fast start on so many of his promises, people were willing to give him some time. But I think an average citizen does not understand what a tariff is. I have a problem in conceptualizing what a tariff does other than to raise the price for goods on both ends, and how ultimately that betters one's ability to purchase products at your point of business. So I realize this is what he's always talked about. He's always been a believer in tariffs. I do understand there's a lot of unfair trading, especially in Europe, that boxes us out of their markets. But I don't know necessarily if this is going to change anything. It certainly is exciting. It's like being on a roller coaster ride. 1 minute, 25% tariff against Mexican products.
Make it 15%.
Right, 15. Oh, wait, European cars, that's it. Lifetime tariff. I'm like, whoa. I had a hard enough time knowing about Mexico, our number one trading partner. You know, Governor, people still think that Red China is our number one trading partner. No, it's Mexico.
You're absolutely right.
After the lockdown and pandemic, a lot of companies decided because you couldn't get any products out of China, you might as well put a subsidiary in Mexico. That's our biggest trading partner. And by the way, they sell us products and they send us human beings. I think we've said we'll take your products with a tariff on it, but we don't want any more of your human beings coming across the border.
So I don't know how many people on the left are listening to this show. I know a number of people on the right are, and I'm sure they wholeheartedly agree with you. But what I would say is, do you think that your message in this current campaign is such that people who might have typecast you or something like that, might see a real sense of reason and a real sense of working things out to the point that they might maybe go back and jump party lines and vote for Republican this time.
Well, if it was one-on-one, a traditional Democrat versus a traditional Republican, very difficult. The demographics and the makeup of the population, although ethnically and racially somewhat similar, the white percentage of the population has stabilized because of all the hipsters and millennials coming in. The white ethnics have either died or moved to Florida. They're not here in the numbers they were for Rudy Giuliani and David Dinkins. And as you know, the most liberal, progressive, and socialist of the voters are the white hipster and millennials who have come in from Iowa, where there are more pigs than people, and Idaho, where there are more potatoes than people. So you may look at it and say, well, it really hasn't changed all that much. It has changed significantly. What makes this race different, Governor Paterson, is I'm thinking back to 1977. Now, as a 22-year-old kid, my interest was not politics. It was baseball. Remember, Yankees win. Reggie Jackson hits 3 home runs, Game 6 against the L.A. Dodgers in the Bronx. And Howard Cosell says the Bronx is burning, and George Steinbrenner is planning to move the Yankees to the Meadowlands. And I'm like a manager of Mickey D's in the Bronx, where I started the Guardian Angels. And I'm like, the Meadowlands? The only thing that is out in the Meadowlands are dead bodies of organized crime and garbage that we dump there. Why would he want to move Yankee Stadium to the Meadowlands after we just won the World Series? And it was because of the deterioration of the quality of life, the crime. People were in despair. But it was also a year that we had 4 qualified candidates to be mayor. So you had Ed Koch, the Democrat, who had a very brutal contest with Mario Cuomo, who decided to run in the general as a liberal. Because remember, he lost in the runoff to Ed Koch for the Democratic nod. You had Roy Goodman, heir of the ex-lax fortune, the Republican state senator from the Upper East Side. And you had Barry Farber, the great talk show host, who had actually run against Bella Abzug previously for Congress. So you had really 4 great candidates, spirited debates. And whenever you have 4 as opposed to 2, start looking at the math. Curtis Sliwa had 29%.
So your 29 is looking pretty good next to a couple of 25s and maybe a 26.
Right. Or I get a few more percentage points as the 3 Democrats who will remain. And remember, you're going to probably have Cuomo as the Democrat. I believe Eric Adams will do a John Lindsay like in 69, run on an independent line to try to keep his mayoralty position. And I think you're going to have Zorhan the Magnificent, the guy who's come out of nowhere from 1% to now upwards of 18% in the polls. The Democratic Socialists of America candidate will be the Working Families Party candidate.
Hold that thought right there, Curtis. We're going to get to Zoran. That was going to be my next question. But we do have sponsors now. And as a matter of fact, Helen Keller Services for the Blind is now a sponsor of this show. I wonder how that happened. But anyway, we're on the left versus the right. Sometimes the left and the right are going in the same direction, but most often they're not. We'll see what happens in the second round with our special co-host, Curtis Sliwa. Right now, let's pause for these commercial messages. We're back on the left versus the right. Left, 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 right, left. And Curtis promised me a story about one of our sponsors, Helen Keller Services, a story about Helen Keller. I thought I'd heard them all, Curtis, but I'm all ears. Or,
wait a second.
I'm not all eyes, but I'm all ears.
Now, Curtis Sliwa, thespian. You're amazed. Well, wait a second. I'm a politician. All politicians are actors or actresses. But my first stage debut, the Plymouth Rock Theater. My mom and dad and my 2 sisters, we went up one summer to help my cousin Jimmy Lonergan, who had just purchased the Plymouth Rock Summer Theater. And he thought that this was like on Broadway. It was an old barn that had to be cleaned out and fitted for plays and for musicals. We went down, we cleaned it up, and the first production was Helen Keller. My oldest sister, Alita, played Helen Keller. I and my youngest sister, Maria, played the kids that were cutting out the papier-mâché dolls with circular scissors so we wouldn't stab ourselves or stab one another.
Right.
My second experience with Helen Keller is, as you know, I lived for a time raising two sons with Melinda Katz, who is now the Queen's DA, Carter and Hunter, in Forest Hills. When you get off at the subway station, 72nd Continental, and you walk towards the gardens, they have these huge plaques. This is where Helen Keller lived. This is where her school was. This is where many people came who were sight impaired to learn how to be able to function in a society back then that didn't have the technology that we did. So you see, Helen Keller became a very important part of my life.
I can see that. I did not know that she lived in Queens.
Oh, yeah, born and raised in Forest Hills. Her father was the conductor of the symphonic orchestra there. So that was her background. But when you enter what they call the Greens, you go through this magnificent arch, and that's where Helen Keller lived, and that's where she taught, and that's where she traveled the world from.
So from Helen Keller to Zoran Mandani, who is running for mayor. He did very well in fundraising. He got matching funds. He is, as I've heard him when he gets interviewed, not like a number of people who tend to be overly progressive, where he's angry at everything and everything has to be thrown out, and that the answer to every question is taxes. He has a pretty well thought out plan. It is certainly more progressive than anything we've seen in the past, in the current administration, but he's going to be on the ballot. He's going to be in the Democratic primary, but how does he beat Andrew Cuomo? I think the only way he beats Andrew Cuomo is if the hipsters are at the polls voting for him.
Well, first off, any mayoral election now is a low turnout election, because we go through 2 years of a presidential election cycle before. Candidates start announcing 2 years before the November 4th date of a presidential election. Voter fatigue. So when I ran against Eric Adams, there were only two candidates in the final, there was so much voter fatigue. J6 had occurred. Trump was saying to Republicans, don't go to early voting, don't do absentee voting, just go on the day of election. People had enough. Getting signatures now to qualify, which you know you had to do, Governor Paterson, when you were running for office, and all candidates have to do, is harder than it's ever been, because now everybody has those Amazon bells where they can look through a camera and they said, oh, here they are. They want me to sign a petition. And they don't come to the front door, because those are the only really good signatures. In the streets, you never know if that's a good signature. You know if there's a registered Republican or a Democrat at a household, that's a good signature. So I've watched Mandani, because I ran a candidate against Tiffany Caban the last city council round, who is a Democratic Socialist of America, like Mandani, and their base is Astoria. They've called it AOC, the People's Republic of Astoria. Everyone elected there is a member of the DSA or converted to the DSA. It truly is the People's Republic of Astoria. And I see how they work. They go and they get young ideological people who will work all day in the streets doing old-fashioned retail politics that you grew up on, that your father taught you and your mother and everybody that you affiliated with in the Harlem Democratic Party. And then they party to the break of dawn. They socialize, they meet and greet one another. They come back the next day. They're all invigorated. They have the energy that your typical institutional Democrats don't have. Now, they have the support of the unions and that. But I think, as you know, Governor David Paterson, union support is strong, but they're not able to muster the troops like they used to.
Not at all.
And they can't necessarily convince their members that because the leadership has decided to go with Cuomo or Adams or Adrian Adams or whomever, that that's who their members are going to vote for, or even show up. Only 22% of the people registered showed up for the mayoralty vote. And that means if you have really dedicated, ideologically pure young people who understand they got to go out and vote. And this year, a little different. Nobody's talked about this. You can register new voters 10 days before election. So when early voting starts, 10 days before November 4th, you could be registering new
and
voters.
have voted by the time the election comes up.
Now, think of how many new voters they're going to register with all their. So let's say they lose to Cuomo in the Democratic Party primary, but because of ranked choice voting, which most people don't understand other than Frank Morano, it's like a bingo card. If he does relatively well, which I think he will, now he becomes the Working Families Party candidate, and they start registering voters for the Working Families Party, which will help that party that was tried, as you know, to be destroyed by Andrew Cuomo. How dare you run Cynthia Nixon against me as a Working Families Party candidate? It destroyed all the third parties, including the one I was chairman of at the time, Reform Party, Libertarian Party, Green Party, Independence Party. It just strengthened the Working Families Party, so now you only have two independent parties, Conservatives and Working Families Party. I think you not only have to keep an eye on Mamdani, he's an expert on film. I do a lot of posting with good videos. His mother is a top-flight movie maker.
Interesting.
Well, and he's gone back and forth to Uganda, where he was born and raised initially, in an Indian family in Uganda. He made films there. He knows all about the importance of films. As much as I disagree with him politically on almost everything, he does excellent social networking, which is a way to micro-target voters, because general media doesn't do it. Look, you spend money on general media, only 20% of the people are going to come out. So 80% of the people learn about you, but they don't vote. So he knows how to micro-target. I've learned how to micro-target.
So
and that's what might beat the institutional establishment in a primary.
So he's got a shot. Now, do you think also one of his advantages is that he is one of the candidates running in the Democratic primary that doesn't have pre-existing investigations or accusations or problems such as what would be presumed to be the two front runners, which would be Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Adams?
Well, that helps as a Democrat. But as you know, some people who are on the right believe he should be deported just because he was not born and raised here in America first. He was actually born in Uganda. I'm sure there is an effort to deport him as we speak because this guy's on fire. Now, again, I disagree with him on almost every issue. I stood with him and liberals and progressives and socialists. And the other day on Sunday, when the 15,000 dead were honored who died as a result of the executive order of Andrew Cuomo during the lockdown and pandemic of March 25th of 2020, Janice Steen and her family members. So it was right wing with left wing. And we all were united in saying what Andrew Cuomo did was wrong, and he should have apologized to the families and the friends, which he's refused to do. But he's got a following. You got to watch him, and if you're a Democrat with ranked choice voting, he has a chance to pull an upset because if
everybody's number two and eventually become number one.
Absolutely. You got to understand how bingo works. The last time around, Kathy Garcia and Andrew Yang decided to take advantage of ranked choice voting too late on Juneteenth. And Eric Adams immediately accused Andrew Yang of being a racist. How dare you announce this on Juneteenth? You're a racist, which clearly Eric Adams plays that race card whenever possible. And it served him well, although this time nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. That's why I think he'll end up running as an independent.
Now, I will try to match your Helen Keller story by telling you a David Paterson campaign debate story.
Oh.
It's 1986. No, it's 1988. And I am the sitting state senator, and a Republican from the Upper West Side, whose name I think was Ladigo, I may not be pronouncing his name right, decides he's running as well. And so, of course, cable TV decide that they have to have a debate with Ladigo and myself. And I come to the debate, and, he and I are going at it right and wrong, back and forth, the left versus the right. And at one point he says, all he really does is go to Albany and hang out with the people. He doesn't do anything, doesn't pass any legislation. And then he comes home and asks for your vote. So when it was my turn, I listed 4 or 5 pieces of legislation I'd sponsored, even though I'm a first-term Democrat, and a whole bunch of other things I did. And it's not just being in Albany, it's being in the community. I've done that. And Mr. Ladigo looks at me and he says, "You really did all those things?" And I said, "Yes." He said, well, then maybe I'll vote for you. He was the Republican candidate, and he actually said this.
He basically did a J.D. Vance.
A J.D. Vance, yeah.
He took you off guard like
Yes.
he did Tampon Tim in his debate.
J.D. Vance must have seen that film. And by the way, just for historic preservation, that night was the same night that the vice presidential debate was held between the vice presidential candidate, help me, Curtis, from
Lloyd Benson
Lloyd Benson, and
versus Potato Man.
Dan Quayle.
Right.
And that's the night that Benson says, I knew John Kennedy. I was a friend of John Kennedy's. You're no John Kennedy. Unfortunately, that quote was, can you believe it, was favored over mine the next day in the news media.
I just can't imagine that. And this was the local.
This is a local state
network
senate, yeah.
That they had to go, what was it, MSN or something
It was like
that.
Manhattan Cable TV. This is
I am surprised.
long before the days of New York One.
You had a Republican candidate because generally Upper West Side.
In fact, he was the Republican candidate, but he was also the conservative candidate, and apparently the conservatives kind of gave the Republicans a hard time, so they let him run on both lines.
I am incredible that you didn't have a coronation because oftentimes now, if you, especially in Manhattan, which has turned all blue, you will see that in many of the races, there is no Republican, no conservative running at all. It's basically Democrat. If they have a primary, that's it. That's the general election. Or if they have no challengers, it's a coronation. We need a two-party, three-party, four-party system. We have to have debates, and we have to have competition because if you only have a one-party system, either all Democrats or all Republicans, you don't have a checks and balances.
And that would break down the tremendous impact that money has, that previous relationships have in advancing candidates way ahead of their opponents, so that people who may have some great ideas for the city or the state or even the country really don't get the airtime. They really don't get heard from. And they've got a few of them right now in the Democratic primary who are pretty sharp, but they'll never get the chance.
Yeah, but then they have these goofy lightning rounds. You give a one-word answer to a goofball question.
I know.
It's like, I remember in one of the debates against Eric Adams, because everything was truncated, 30 seconds, 1 minute.
8 seconds.
Right. We're looking at a potential $4 billion deficit in the budget in the city of New York. Mr. Sliwa, how would you handle it if you were mayor? I said, I can't even tell you in 30 seconds how to balance a checkbook appropriately.
Right, exactly.
Do you think maybe we should spend a little more time having discourse on this, more of a conversation? Such an important issue about whether you're in debt, a deficit, whatever. You know, in the city, unlike the federal government, which just prints money and raises the ceiling, you have to have a balanced budget. That requires a little bit of conversation. Governor Paterson, I would do what we're doing right now. Have the candidates come, have a discussion. You start with one issue, affordable housing. Maybe the next one is cost of living. The fourth discussion, not a debate, because it's going to get you need a moderator to keep it cool and calm. If you law and order, then quality of life, and then the last one would be education. Let's say you had 5 subjects, 5 different conversations. The voters would be so much better off. And just have one moderator, please, and don't make the moderator the focus of the discussion and the debate. It should be the two candidates.
Exactly, because what we've seen in a lot of debates now is that the news anchors that are hosting the debates are so enthralled with the possibility that what they say is going to get heard, or that they can change the conversation and become part of it as opposed to the host of it. It makes it very difficult for the candidates. They have enough trouble debating each other. Now they have to debate the chair.
The best one, and I say it again, 1977, Gabe Pressman, the dean of all news people at Channel 4 NBC. And he's dealing with Ed Koch, good debater. Mario Cuomo, excellent debater. Roy Goodman, good debater, Republican. And Barry Farber, obviously a wordsmith. And he handled it magnificently. Everyone's point of view was heard. And the voters ultimately made their decision for Ed Koch. But it was a fair debate. And Gabe Pressman understood his boundaries. It's just to make sure that people are given equal time so
Right.
their views could be heard.
And your point of view will be heard a little more right after we come back from another commercial break. I'm David Paterson. He's Curtis Sliwa, who wishes he was David Paterson. And we will be back right after these commercial messages. We're back on 77 WABC. And we're moments away from hearing a little music, Curtis, at 5 o'clock.
Ah.
When Vinny comes in.
Oh, the
starts
Staten
playing.
Island Prince?
Yes,
Vinny
Staten
Maduro.
Island Prince, and then Cousin Brucey at 6. And all we have to do is to sound, moderately relevant, so people will continue to tune in right after we finish this program. But we've been talking about political campaigns. We've been talking about the president's economic agenda. And we've been talking about just the history of events in New York City and different campaigns and things that happen. And I'm sure those of you who listen in to hear these types of things can cite some other issues we didn't touch. But in terms of New York State, New York State is in an interesting situation because its governor, Kathy Hochul, is going to run for re-election in 2026. What would happen if she had to run against her old boss, Andrew Cuomo? What about that, Curtis?
Oh, wow. Well, first off, if we play fantasy politics, let's assume Cuomo is the mayor, Hochul is still the governor, and Tish James is the attorney general. It's going to be like 3 scorpions in a brandy glass. None of them get along. Now, Tish of late gets along with Hochul. It's like a tag team partners because they both hate Cuomo. And Cuomo already is grumbling about how Tish James is dropping information from the sexual harassment suits to injure him on behalf of her candidate, Adrienne Adams. Now, whether that amounts to anything, I don't know. But from a Republican point of view, if I get 33 or 35% of the vote in the general election, pretty much what Pataki got against Cuomo, if a Republican is able to get 33 or 35% in the city against the Democrat, that Republican will become the next governor of the state of New York because they do tremendously well upstate. They lose Westchester, and they generally get about 28% of the vote in New York City. If they do what George Pataki did against Mario Cuomo, where he got 33% of the vote, then you're going to see either a Mike Lawler, who seems to be interested as a Republican, or Bruce Blakeman, the Nassau County executive, do well. I don't think the newly reinvented, reformed Richie Torres is going to be able to hurt Hochul, who's sitting on a pile of money. If there's one thing about Hochul, she's a horrible governor to me, but she is a fundraising machine. And I don't think that Richie Torres has either the name recognition or the gravitas to be able to take her out in a Democratic primary. Remember, last time around, she ran against, to her left, Jumaane Williams, to her right, Swazi, and she beat both of them. So you can't count her out. Now, in a general election, though, she, I think, can be beat by Lawler, who has to avoid a MAGA challenger in his Republican primary, because, as you know, he's not a MAGA guy. And Bruce Blakeman is a MAGA guy. So if he runs MAGA with the support of Donald Trump, he could potentially win a Republican primary. And then it's a question of Hochul's money versus the fact that a Republican will have to spend all of their time in New York City getting that 33 to 35%.
Right.
And then they'll be the governor.
Now, do you think that where Lawler and Bruce Blakeman, who I know a lot better because, I grew up in Nassau County, and Bruce Blakeman actually did not. He lived in New York City. He moved to Nassau County when he got married because his wife's children lived there, which was an honorable thing to do. But as soon as he got to Nassau County, they started talking to him about running for office, and he's gotten to the position of county executive. But do you think somebody needs to take Lawler and Blakeman and put them in the same room and say, look, we're going to work this out. One of you is going to run for governor, and the other is going to wait, and we'll take care of you later on.
I think they'll try that, but I think both of these men realize they have a possibility. Again, I don't see Lawler as a MAGA candidate. He really walks the fine line. I do see Blakeman as a MAGA candidate because he's very close and is always promoting the Trump agenda. That would be a spirited Republican primary like we had the last time with Zeldin versus Andrew Giuliani versus Rob Astorino versus Wilson, Harry Wilson. Wow, that was a great primary.
That is a lot for one primary in a governor's race.
But I think it sharpened up Zeldin for his general election against Hochul. He almost rode the crime issue to victory, but he hadn't spent enough time in New York City. Now, obviously, you go upstate, you're a hero. You go into Nassau and Suffolk now, you're a hero. You go into the lower Hudson Valley, you're a hero. Westchester, they throw you out because it's all blue. But a Republican must do better in New York City if they are going to become the governor against Kathy Hochul.
So then that would probably favor Lawler, who is, as you said, really not a mega Republican, but a person who's conservative and respected, and rarely does he go off course. That maybe he would have the better shot. He
would, but he got to win. He has to win the Republican primary first. And if you're not MAGA or very supportive of Donald Trump, it's very difficult to do. We saw that Zeldin was, Andrew Giuliani was, Rob Astorino was, but not so much Wilson. Harry Wilson had the money, and it really didn't serve him well in a Republican primary. You're really upstate and in the lower Hudson Valley, you really have to be a Trumper if you're going to win a Republican primary.
And as we go through this political year, obviously there are a lot of other things going on other than that, but your take right now on Trump and New York City, particularly Trump, the governor, and congestion pricing.
Well, number one, I'm an opponent of congestion pricing, the only person running for mayor who's an opponent of it. I like the dance that Trump is doing with Hochul on congestion pricing, and the Secretary of Transportation demanding the stats of the crime, that nobody believes that we're safer in New York City or the subways, the perception of crime, as Jessica Tisch would say or Mayor Adams would say. People feel we are having a crime problem. So I think there might be some horse trading here. At least the president is setting up it that way. And I will say that right now the candidate for Donald Trump in the mayoral election is Eric Adams. Because whatever Trump says, Eric Adams says, yes, sir. How high do you want me to jump?
And it certainly seems to be borne out that way. Just 2 days ago, the Tom Holman said he's very happy with what the mayor's doing in the city, but that's great for him in terms of maybe what his economic future may be. But I don't think it's great for him in terms of his candidacy in the Democratic
Well,
primary.
let's look at like Fox News Channel, which has an appeal to a lot of conservatives and Republicans. In Butte, Montana, they love Eric Adams. Yeah, he's working. He's working with Trump. He's working with Holman. Republicans love him out there. But when you're a Republican in New York City, you don't trust Eric Adams because you said this guy was the Biden of Brooklyn in the beginning. Now all of a sudden he's like pro-Trump. So Republicans don't trust him. Democrats hate him now because they feel he's aligned to Donald Trump. And he's got to get under these 5 indictments. I don't know what the Judge Ho is waiting for, but he can't run a campaign until Ho actually follows the directions of the very attorney that he appointed to be a third-party intermediary in this, who delivered a report.
Came back with a decision, and he sat on it for 3 weeks.
And is continuing to sit on it, which I understand, Eric Adams. I don't feel his pain because a lot of it is self-inflicted. But he'll never be able to run a campaign until that is resolved. And by the way, I know he's running as a third-party as a independent candidate because he appointed Randy Mastro, first deputy mayor, who I think you and I both understand can run this city on his own. And that would free up Eric Adams to spend a lot of time campaigning and taking shots at Andrew Cuomo because he's got to do better in a Democratic primary.
Right. And he would have a different forum if he is an independent. Andrew's running as the Democrat. What was the other person you said was thinking?
Oh, Working Families Party The magnificent
Zoran Mondani.
Because remember, Working Families Party, if it is Cuomo, they will run their own candidate. They hate Cuomo.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is like a blood feud, something that Cuomo loves. He loves these vendettas and blood feuds. It's like right out of The Godfather, right? He hated the Working Families Party. He tried to put him out of existence. All he did was put all the other third parties out of existence and strengthen the Working Families Party. So I think they want to retaliate against him. They want to prevent him from becoming mayor of the city of New York.
So now with those three in the race, could that clear a path? Kind of like when the defensive players bump into each other and fall down. When Curtis Sliwa, carrying the ball, runs past all of them and becomes the next mayor of the city of New York.
Let me take you back to another famous race involving the U.S. Senate nod for the Democratic Party. Three titans of the Democratic Party ran against one another. Geraldine Ferrara could have been vice president.
Right.
Elizabeth Holtzman could have been U.S. Senator. Barely lost to Alphonse D'Amato and Jake Javits, who didn't know it was time to hang it up.
Right.
And Bobby Abrams, who could have been U.S. Senator, lost to Al D'Amato. The three of them are arguing with one another. Al Sharpton is on the side. He was elevated in the mind of the electorate because he took the high road. I believe that you're going to see Curtis Sliwa basically marginalized to a degree because I'm the Republican. And remember, the other line I have that none of them have is the animal welfare line. Everybody loves animals, Democrats and Republicans. And they're going to be so busy attacking one another. Eric Adams attacking Cuomo, Zorhan attacking the both of them both attacking Zorhan, that I'll be waving on the sideline, and the few things that I say, people will say, wow, he sounds mayoral. He sounds like he has a grip on the subjects, because what I'll be saying is, guys, come on. Let's get a little civil here. Let's discuss the issues.
Yes.
All you're doing is yelling and screaming and pointing fingers, and you're not saying what necessarily you would do. As mayor, this is what I would do. Watch. That worked for Sharpton. It worked for Andrew Giuliani and his Republican primary against Zeldin, Astorino, and Wilson, because remember, they put him in the Hollywood Squares box because he wouldn't get vaccinated, and all three of them were yelling at one another, and Andrew, the few times he spoke, was elevated. You see, this has happened before.
And he was, we never heard that he got anything as a result of not being vaccinated. So he won all the way around.
Exactly. And the only time he did spar with the other three was when he was on the stage in Rochester when they eliminated that you have to be vaccinated rule. He actually did great in those debates where they wouldn't allow him to be on the stage because Astorino would, scream at Zeldin. Zeldin would get very mad at Wilson, who he felt was just there to act as a spoiler with his money. And all Andrew was saying is, and by the way, let's get back on track here. This is what I would do as governor. Remember how people said, wow, Andrew is really a good candidate here.
Yes, they did. They did. Now, I did primary night here on WABC with Dominic Carter and Andrew Giuliani, and they were great to work with. They were really terrific. There are so many other things we could cover, Curtis, but I just want to make an apology to you. I'm really sorry that Steve Cohen and I lured Juan Soto to the Mets, and that's where he'll be playing this year. Now, he did strike out to end the game with the tying runs and on base in Game 1. But I still think that the Mets will be playing in the World Series. And I'd like to invite you to come with me. Of course, by then you may be bordering on becoming mayor, so you know what happens when mayors go to baseball games, because it happened to me.
Believe it or not, I think you had the steal of the century. How Steinbrenner could allow Juan Soto to go across town to the Mets and and you know why it was. Not Aaron Rodgers, but Aaron Judge did not fight to keep Soto in the lineup. You notice that. He never spoke on that.
He didn't really say anything.
He could have deferred some of his money to make it easier for Steinbrenner Jr. to match Steve Cohen with his money. In fact, Soto is an exciting ball player. I think you're going to get into the playoffs, but there's Otani and the Dodgers standing in your way.
This is a problem.
Huge problem.
Yeah.
Half of Japan is now playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers. I'd like to know where they got all the money to hire these guys.
They could have been migrants who were, brought in to seal the deal.
Well, you see, that's the only time we like Venezuelans because they're such great baseball players. Look at your Met manager who was our bench coach, Mendoza, Venezuelan.
Yes. Absolutely.
We love Venezuelans because they play baseball. We don't like them when they're migrants.
So, kind enough as you were to come off of your campaign trail and coming back here, even while on sabbatical, to talk to us today, is there anything you'd like to say in the, minute and 20 seconds we have left?
Yes, producer, why don't you go tell Vinny Madunio to do a performance that he oftentimes does in Atlantic City where he performs his Bobby Rydell. We're going to take an extra hour. And Cousin Bruce, see, he has a policy, as you know, no politics, no politics. This is a political season. I think it is incumbent upon us, Governor David Paterson, for you and I to requisition the next 5 hours and continue this discussion because it is so pertinent
Absolutely.
to the national, regional, and local political situation.
We're going to run it up the flagpole. So those of you who are listening in, if in the next few minutes you hear music playing, you'll know that we lost. Anyway, it's David Paterson with my co-host, who is outstanding on this station regularly and right now is off running for mayor of the city of New York, Curtis Sliwa. Thank you so much for joining us here on WABC, the left versus the right, and sometimes the left is right.